to this, our next in a series of roundtables. We're going to delve into soil restoration a little bit. We're trying something a little new. We've got a remote presenter, so we're going to have some technical changes to make. So bear with us a little bit, but hopefully this goes smooth, and you guys will be able to ask Stu some questions as well once we get started. Get rid of a few things here. So first off, like I say, I always like to have our community partners up and give them some props for helping us do this urban program. We also have a urban program sponsor with Able Printing. They've been really helpful in a lot of the materials that we get out to everyone, and I hope you enjoy them. So, like I say, restoring stormwater services and compacted urban soils. That's what we're going to kind of focus on here today. Before that, I've got some upcoming events to let everybody know about. Our annual good housekeeping training will be for our partners coming up in the county here. September 14th. Ohio Stormwater Awareness Week will be October 1st through 7th, and that's really a time for partners to engage their public and kind of get together in a statewide event that we're promoting for everyone, and to get some of that MS4 public participation, that kind of thing out there. So it's really a good time. There's a QR code. That SAW code up there is to Stormwater Awareness Week. You can access a toolkit there for things to reach out to your community with. It's a good resource. Hope you join us in that effort. We're really looking to get statewide efforts in that. I'm a board member of OSWA, or Ohio Stormwater Association. We've got a webinar coming up. It's our usual yearly regulatory update with Lou McMahon, DeGullis. He's a really knowledgeable guy on the law side of environmental issues, and he'll be joining us in that October 5th webinar. You can get that on the OSWA website. And then Warren SWCD is having their urban chat next week. Jay is going to be part of that, it sounds like. There's, again, QR code if you want to join in that. I know the registration ended for that yesterday, but I think if you talk nicely to Tessa Allen, she might let you join in remotely. I think they were just getting reservations for a lunch that they're offering in person. So just to let you know, that will be next week. Again, there's that QR code if you want to join in on that. And it really dovetails nicely with what we're talking about here. So I think it's a good follow-up to this talk here. So today's agenda, we've got Stu Schwartz. He's the senior research scientist for University of Maryland. If you saw him at the Stormwater Conference, he did a talk on this same subject, but more directed at kind of the reforestation, forestry aspect. And we talked to him about looking at what can we do in urban situations? How does that differ, and what value is that to us? So the whole kind of theme we've been looking at here is this sustainability toolkit and the practices involved. And if you look at what we've got for practices, first off, non-structural and programmatic, I think, get overlooked a lot of times. There's a lot of abilities that we have as either agencies or municipalities. Look at preservation and conservation. That's the first and foremost thing you can do. Let's keep what we have already. What else can we do? Density. When you get into zoning, that's another aspect that we need to look at, and how we improve that density to preserve and conserve what we have. Tree codes, another valuable tool out there for municipalities. We've had a pretty big push for the urban canopy development here in Columbus, and yet at the same time we're losing forested areas to existing and current development. Repairing setbacks and drainage easements, another thing to look at. We have a lot of areas that need that protection because climate change is happening, folks, and a lot of these streams are readjusting. If we had setbacks in many of these areas, we wouldn't have problems, property problems. Most of our drainage calls are directly related to property damage or property problems, not so much related to the preservation of those areas. If we were set back away from those, we wouldn't see as much problem as what we perceive without having repairing setbacks. So a couple of non-structural things. If you look in the table 4B practices and the permit, what's permitted, what do we have to do when we do construct? I want to just point out, a lot of these are infiltration practices, and we're dealing with infiltration that goes to the surrounding area, not only just to the BMP that we're installing. So it's something to think about. Most of these are infiltration practices. Runoff reduction methodology, if you're looking to do that on a site, again, all of these are really based on infiltration. So we need to think about that infiltration. The common thing they have there is those soils. When we look at the Ohio water, what our water budget is like, you've got 38 inches, which this is an old slide. It needs to go up to about 42 now, I think. But almost 2/3 of that is entering into the unsaturated zone of the soils. 2/3 of that. Tied in with the plants, you get that evapotranspiration. That's where 2/3 of our water budget is going. So just think about that when we go into paved situations in urban areas. What kind of soils do we have left after mass grading? Those are the kind of issues that we look at, and how can we use soils better? So with that, I'm going to drop it off to Stu. Hopefully I'm going to make a switch here.
Give me a minute to make him a co-host.
Let me do my bit here. So I'm muted now.
Stu, can you hear us? Trying to get audio from him over there.
Oh, there we go. How's that?
I think we'll work it now.
Okay, and let me pull up. Let's see. Let me. Sorry, just trying to share my screen. How's that? Can you see that okay?
Yep, let's go through.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. Sorry for the mix up there. I had to reboot my machine to enable the mic, but I'm very pleased to be able to join you this morning. Thanks so much for the invitation. And I think that preamble really was a great jumping off point for this presentation. As you mentioned, this is some work that various parts of it we've presented elsewhere and had a presentation at the Stormwater Conference. But I'd just like to go through this with a little bit more of an orientation to a stormwater audience, if you will. And I want to make this as useful for you guys as I can. So if I'm going off in a direction that is a little askew, don't hesitate to, stop me and redirect me or ask for a deeper dive in some areas that matter to you. But really, this is a presentation that if you take nothing else from it, this is our picture of what we're trying to do. And the picture is really that the urban pervious landscape has a pervasive challenge of disturbed compacted soil profiles, just as the consequence of standard means and methods, mass grading and development. And we've been looking at ways in which we can change that to develop a soil profile that supports infiltration for our infiltration practices, characterized by a porous, permeable, organic rich, biologically active soil profile that enables deep-rooted, densely rooted vegetation to take advantage of higher levels of soil, water, and infiltration. So that's kind of the picture that we've painted. And I think it's important to point out that the reason that I think these disturbed compacted profiles are so pervasive is that they are the logical, rational consequence of the specifications and the standards that we're asking our contractors to meet. We're not getting these impaired soil profiles because contractors are, for the most part, because they're negligent or incompetent, but much to the contrary. It's a skilled, experienced, professional approach to conforming to our standards and specs. And the corollary is, if we want different outcomes, we need to ask for different outcomes by changing our standards and specs. So that's kind of the overview. But again, I start from the perspective that much of the urban pervious landscape, I often say, can be described as grass growing in a thin veneer of topsoil and compacted fill because of disturbed compacted profiles. This is a picture I've shown many, many times over the years. It's from a development in Northeast Ohio. Some of you may know the actual fate of this development, the City View Center in Northeast Ohio, which is a very interesting story. And I only learned recently that this.
Sorry. We are actually
okay.
seeing your PowerPoint presentation without not the slide preview.
I'm sorry, say that again.
We're just seeing the PowerPoint with the slides to the left. So we're not in presenter view.
Sorry, I didn't quite understand. Just the echo. Let's see. Is this any better for you?
Maybe you can unmute yourself and start that better, Dave.
Are you not? You're not seeing my screen? Is that the problem?
We can see your screen. It's just not posting forward.
Oh, it didn't advance.
I got my speaker off as well. So
I get John
Yeah,
Fryer
great.
meetings.
So do you see this slide called disturbed compacted urban soils?
hold on a second. We're missing.
I'm just trying to talk with them without causing extra.
Okay.
Yeah, we're trying to get the screen. They did. All right, guys. Challenges of hybrid meetings.
So Stu, we can see slide 3. It's not in presenter mode, but we can see the slide that
Okay.
says disturbed compacted.
And if I go
soils.
back to presenter mode, you see that full screen?
No, I'm guessing you have 2 monitors maybe, and you might be
Nope.
presenting on the one. Oh, well, I don't know.
No, I only have one monitor.
We can see it. You can still click through it this way. You'll just have to, advance down with the down arrow.
Okay, give me just 30 seconds to try one thing to see if let me put it in presenter. No, let's see.
You need to go to the slideshow.
So you're just seeing the PowerPoint window with the slides in it, is that right?
That's correct.
I have a feeling that the problem might be that when I share the screen, I have to be in PowerPoint mode in order to see the toolbar at the bottom. Let me try it one more time. So you're able to see the slides, but it's in PowerPoint mode now?
Correct.
And if I go to screen share like that, you still see it in PowerPoint mode?
Yes, it's not changing.
I'm not sure how to remedy that. Is it large enough that you can make out the slides in PowerPoint mode?
You think the slides are large enough? It's mode if you.
Does that help?
Click through.
That's better.
Just
okay. Well, I apologize for the snafu. I'm not sure what's happening there.
Duplicate view.
What? Just in the interest of time, is this okay if I carry on in this mode?
Is this okay
Definitely.
if we just carry it? Or is someone else? We're getting a lot of different audio between the remote people. trying to give advice as well.
Okay, well, T, I apologize. I'm not quite sure what I'm doing wrong here, but if this will be functional, why don't I carry on?
You're gonna see.
Okay, I'll take that as a yes. Okay, so I like to show this slide because to me it sort of captures what I think of as typical modern land development, with the small convoy of earth-moving vehicles that starts by removing vegetation and stripping topsoil, doing mass grading to meet plans before putting in improvements, and then as your penultimate step, perhaps spreading a few inches of topsoil on the remaining unpaved surfaces. And I like to point out in particular, for this little monadnock of soil that's left, that 4 to 5 foot section of soil represents maybe 12 to 18 inches of water holding capacity that's not just diminished by compaction, but is going to be removed from the site because of our development practices. And so it precludes the possibility of doing on-site stormwater controls from the start. Even if we pave this big box parking lot with pervious concrete, and we can reliably produce pervious concretes that will infiltrate 1,000 inches an hour and have all the load-bearing strength you need for a parking lot, but there's no place for that infiltration to go in these disturbed, compacted soils. So I've often said that modern land development is really performing an infiltrationectomy on the landscape by removing a priori the infiltration capacity of the site. And that's a direct consequence of disturbed, compacted urban soils. I presume for this audience, talking about urban landscapes or the urban built environment as having a pervasive problem of disturbed, compacted urban soils is not a new or radical idea. I think many of you know Bill Schuster, who for many years was an extremely productive researcher at the EPA Cincinnati lab before he went to Wright State, where he's the chairman of civil engineering. But he and his colleagues published a paper in Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, where they reported on results from doing pedology on soil cores in 11 different cities around the country, consistently finding that the urban soil profiles were missing soil horizons that were present in the pre-urbanization soil. And of course, in Ohio, you guys know better than I do the need to adjust urban soil expectations due to construction based on your adjusted hydrologic soil group procedure that's part of the rainwater manual. So I start from the presumption that talking about the problem of disturbed, compact, and urban soils is nothing new and has found a home or a receptive audience here for this presentation. We all know why that happens. It is, as I said, the logical response to our standards and specs, and it's deeply embedded in our standard practices. Here's a site that I visited near my office and followed construction, and you can see in the upper left, even as the new compacted foundation pads are being prepared for the next round of townhouse development, this first set of townhomes are occupied, and those owners are trying to set up and establish their lawns that consist in this case of a dense, beautiful, verdant, lush cover of turf grass growing in an inch of soil cut from a sod farm. Now you can grow a perfectly acceptable vegetative cover in an inch of sod, in an inch of soil. It's going to have very limited fertilizer and water holding capacity. So you're going to have to fertilize and water the heck out of it to keep the turf out of stress. But you can grow a perfectly acceptable cover in an inch of topsoil. The problem is this inch of soil or so is going to be quickly saturated by just 1 or 2/10 of an inch of rainfall or irrigation. And once that's saturated, the vertical percolation is so low that this saturated pervious land use behaves very much like an impervious surface for rainfall, producing runoff like an asphalt parking lot. You notice this puddle in the foreground of this picture, which was taken on a day when it hadn't rained in over a week. Where's that water coming from? Well, it's coming from this sprinkler head with the hose running back to this house, because these homeowners are just desperately watering the bejesus out of this turf, trying to keep it out of water stress and hoping it will somehow find a way to grow roots into this compacted material on which it's been placed. And the key point is there's nothing that you can learn from looking at the condition of your turf that will tell you if you're trying to grow vegetation in a soil profile that is a sort of deep, porous, permeable profile that allows the development of deep, dense roots like this. And you'll notice that the rooting depth on this slope failure at the edge of an athletic field is limited by the depth to contact with this massive block of compacted fill that was covered over with topsoil. But nothing you can see on the surface, nothing in an aerial photograph that will tell you if you're in this kind of a soil profile or if you're growing grass in this kind of a soil profile. And we were really dumbfounded when we took these cores from the grassy field you see in the background to see that the entire root zone and virtually all the biological soil processes and most of the hydrologic processes are confined to these little muffin tops that literally lifted right off of the amorphous compacted fill beneath them. So this is sort of my mental picture when I talk about grass growing in a thin veneer of topsoil on compacted fill. We see this, and we see this commonly. Excuse me. It's not an unknown phenomenon, far from it. This is a quote from Chapter 7 of the National Engineering Handbook, and I think in some ways, it's one of the most significant and one of the most overlooked qualifications in the National Engineering Handbook that reminds us that there is no supposition about the hydrologic properties of disturbed soils that can be made from the natural soils when we're dealing with disturbed soils, that an on-site investigation should be made. So what that's really saying is that for most cases, the information in the soil survey or in the national soil databases like StatsGo and Surgo are not reliable predictors of the properties or the hydrologic functions we should expect from disturbed, compacted urban soils. And of course, the Ohio construction adjustment procedure is an attempt to address just this issue. And there are other attempts in other states as well. But the basic problem here, I would suggest to you, is disturbed, compacted urban soils. Well, if on-site investigations are needed, on-site investigations you shall have. So we spent several years doing field work in which we sampled more than 300 residential yards, more than 75 vacant lots, a number of recreational athletic fields to ask how compacted are urban soils. And what we found is that the vast majority of the soils we sampled had a bulk density that was higher than what we call native bulk density. That's the bulk density we would predict based on the texture and organic matter of the soil. Not only was the bulk density higher, but the vast majority of those urban soils had a bulk density that was more than 5% higher, and the majority of them had a bulk density that was more than 10% higher. Now, if you're not used to thinking about bulk density and infiltration, you might say, how big a deal is that? What difference does a 10% increase in bulk density make? Well, to answer that, the figure on the left shows the standard soil texture triangle on which we've superimposed contours that show the percent reduction in saturated hydraulic conductivity when a healthy uncompacted soil has its bulk density increased by just 10%. So an increase in bulk density of just 10% disproportionately reduces infiltration capacity, or KSAT, reducing the KSAT of the clay loam textures anywhere from 25 to 40%. And for the loamy soil textures, a 10% increase in bulk density could be expected to decrease infiltration from 40 to more than 65%, a real disproportionate reduction in infiltration capacity from that first increment of compaction in an otherwise uncompacted soil. And the reason for that, the explanation really is found in the change in the pore size distribution and the pore geometry of a soil when we compact it. On the right are some pictures that I think are really kind of neat from an experiment done by some soil scientists in France, where they took water stable aggregate, those large crumbs that aggregate the sand, silt, and clay size particles that are found in a healthy soil, packed them in a ring, and then did a CAT scan before and after applying gentle compaction energy. So the CAT scan is able to resolve the solid phase, shown here in brown, where you can see the outlines of the individual soil aggregates. And with just gentle compaction energy, you can really see how those aggregates are being sort of forced together as the air is squeezed out of the soil, and they're being sort of deformed and broken down into the individual sand, silt, and clay sized particles with a dramatic loss of porosity. In red, the CAT scan resolves the large interconnected macropores that dominate the porosity before compaction and are largely obliterated with even gentle compaction energy. You notice here we have some large macropores that are no longer even interconnected. And that's vital because it's the large interconnected macropores that support infiltration capacity, that continued water entry and drainage from the soil. And with that change in the pore size distribution and geometry, we get a significant increase in the micropores. Think of these as pores that are maybe on the order of, you know, 1/10 of a millimeter or smaller. And we see a dramatic increase in the micropores. And it's the micropores that are important because they hold water back against the pull of gravity by capillary forces, or this is referred to as tension water, and is connected to what we often call suction head or the matrix potential. And the only way the water in those micropores leaves the soil is via evaporation or transpiration from the active pumping of water out of the soil by plant roots. So with that picture in mind, it's really important to understand the dynamic transitions between saturated and unsaturated conditions. Now, that's a real contrast to many of our standard infiltration-based BMPs, where we have a large drainage area being collected in a small footprint, ponded water where we expect to saturate the soil, and the design parameter that controls the water leaving is exfiltration is the saturated hydraulic conductivity. But for a soil, soils are not that often in saturated conditions, and they're constantly transitioning between saturated and unsaturated conditions where the moisture content controls the conductivity of the soil. So it's vital to us to understand that. We tried to understand that by doing soil physics modeling of soil profiles informed by our field work. And to do that, we defined a couple of what I think of as typical endpoints across the spectrum of soil profiles. So we might have a healthy soil profile, which we idealize as an uncompacted soil at native bulk density with 5% organic matter. We call our disturbed profile a topsoiled soil profile, where we assume the profile has its bulk density increased just 10% at 0.5% organic matter, but the top 10 centimeters of the profile has a soil layer at native bulk density and 3% organic matter, and 3% organic matter is a typical spec for topsoiled soil. And then we simulate the effect of a process we call suburban subsoiling, which is deep ripping and compost amendment, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. But with these endpoints as sort of idealized endpoints of the landscape, we can use soil physics modeling to get consistent model-based description on a site-specific, soil-specific basis that we think can support a stormwater credit for soil decompaction and amendment. This is an example of one of those model-based simulations where, again, using 15-minute meteorological data, this is a simulation of 1 full year of that data with rainfall shown in blue bars, like hydrologists like them, showing the daily precipitation. The blue shaded bars at the bottom here are evaporation. The green bars are transpiration. You can see there's typically much more transpiration than evaporation during the growing season. And these red bars show those infrequent times when the rainfall rate is higher than the infiltration rate, and we actually get surface runoff. So for this simulation in a healthy soil profile with vegetation and a root depth of 20 centimeters, we predict about 2 runoff events a year. The lower plot shows the distribution of soil moisture updated on a 15-minute time step. And you see quite clearly during the growing season, the combination of evapotranspiration dries out the soil. And with a 20 centimeter root zone, those roots can very actively pump soil moisture out of the top 20 centimeters and return it to the atmosphere. Excuse me, drying out the soil quite rapidly. And that drying is punctuated by rainfall events. But then sometime around Halloween to Thanksgiving, you know, the days get short with less solar energy and lower temperatures, the vegetation goes dormant, and ET really drops off quite dramatically. And so for 6 months of the year, more or less, from Halloween until pitchers and catchers report for spring training, the soil moisture really stays quite high, very close to field capacity. And starting with that high soil moisture condition, it only takes a little bit of rainfall to bring the soil to saturation. And as that saturated soil can now transmit water at the saturated hydraulic conductivity, we get these plumes, if you will, of drainage and deep recharge to soil water or groundwater recharge. So all of that recharge is occurring during the dormant season because the water demand from this vigorous vegetation during the growing season is using that water too quickly to allow saturated conditions to ever develop. So that conforms with our hydrologic intuition. This is consistent with what we see in the field, I think. I'd be interested in your perspective on that. But then with this as our reference point, we take the same meteorological forcing, the same soil profile, and we say, what happens if we have the same rainfall runoff events on a disturbed compacted soil? And remember, our disturbed compacted soil assumes that the bottom 90 centimeters have a 10% increase in bulk density. The top 10 centimeters are uncompacted soil with 3% organic matter. And we assume that the root zone is going to be confined to that 10 centimeter layer. When we simulate the same meteorological sequence, we see some similarities and some differences. We see the similarity of that intense drying during the growing season, punctuated by rainfall events. But now, since the root zone is only 10 centimeters deep, it's much easier, if you will, for the plants to exhaust the soil water, to dry it out much more rapidly, because there's just less water to draw on. And that modest 10% increase in bulk density in the soil profile is enough to prevent even the saturated conditions that develop so quickly when you're only trying to saturate 10 centimeters of soil. It prevents them from having higher percolation into the rest of the soil profile. So that high rate of transmission at the saturated conductivity isn't occurring, and we're not getting that deep soil moisture recharge. And of course, because it takes less rainfall to saturate the top 10 centimeters, there's more rainfall for runoff. So now, instead of having 2 rainfall events, we actually have 10 or 12 rainfall events scattered throughout the year. And it's not obvious, but the scale here has changed. The runoff from this event in October has increased by a factor of 3. So our disturbed compacted soil profiles are giving us more runoff, less total infiltration, and more intense drying and wetting in this vegetated root zone. That's our mental model based on a soil physics model. And so we have in our projects instrumented the soil profile with a vertical array of soil moisture sensors at 3 different depths. These are data from one example of that, where the lower plots show the soil moisture 4 inches, 9 inches, and 14 inches below the surface. The upper layer is showing the soil temperature. The shallowest soil temperature, 4 inches in light blue, you see that high frequency variation. That's just the diurnal temperature cycle, which is still clearly detectable at 4-inch depth. But notice that in this plot from November of 2020 until March of 2021, soil moisture is staying uniformly high. It never drops below about 32% volumetric soil moisture. And the 4-inch soil moisture in dark blue is responding to rainfall events. It's wetting up and drying down, but still never falling below that 32% volumetric moisture content during the during the dormant season. Even as the soil temperature starts to rise from 5 to 10 degrees centigrade, the soil moisture is still staying relatively high. And it's not until April, when vegetation really gets active, that the soil moisture starts to dry out. And we see that progressive drying of the soil moisture punctuated by rainfall events through the growing season until we get into fall. So these data are validating, at least qualitatively, exactly what we predicted in our soil physics modeling. And that gives us greater confidence to use the soil physics modeling to make inferences, not just about one soil texture, but about all the soil textures and the different soil profiles. And again, our perspective really is grounded in the view that disturbed compacted soil profiles are the problem. So the question is, what can we do about it? And we've been working on a family of soil decompaction and amendment practices that we call suburban subsoiling, to allude to the fact that we started by trying to adapt the knowledge from agricultural subsoiling practices to the urban landscape. This was an early project we did with the city of Baltimore at the Yorkwood Elementary School. And the city of Baltimore, like most cities and like most DOTs, has an MS4 permit, and their MS4 permit gives them credit for impervious area removal. So they entered into an innovative program with the Board of Education to go back to old public schools like this one and remove their asphalt playgrounds and replace it with grass with a pervious land use to get impervious area removal credits. We were very fortunate to be able to partner with the city of Baltimore, and I credit Bill Stack when he was still with the city of Baltimore for this, so that half of this field was treated with standard topsoiling practices based on the standard city spec book. On the other half of the field, we were able to implement suburban subsoiling. And the practice I call suburban subsoiling basically consists of deep ripping to a depth of at least 20 inches to break up and decompact the massive structure of the compacted soil profile, followed by surface application of 2 to 3 inches of compost, which we try to incorporate to a depth of 6 to 9 inches in order to achieve a 2-to-1 soil to compost ratio. And many of you, I think, will recognize that getting 9 inches of incorporation with a rotary tiller is not such an easy task, though lots of folks will say, oh, sure, no problem. It's really something of a challenge, and we can talk about that means and methods later if that's of interest. But we established these 2 different treatments on the field. The field was then hydroseeded with the same seed mix at the same time. And within a very short period of time, we were able to see dramatic differences in the quality of the turf cover. On the standard topsoiling half of the field, the cover was really spotty and irregular and thin, and it became dominated with opportunistic clover and broad-bladed rhizomatous crabgrass. On the suburban subsoiling half of the field, we had a really dense, lush, verdant turf cover with more than twice the standing biomass as the standard topsoiling side of the field. And we credit that that turf, which is really so vigorous that it's largely outcompeting the weed species. We credit that to the differences in the soil profile. You see below in these soil probes the depth of compost incorporation on the suburban subsoiling field that added organic matter compared to this thin humic layer in the material that was left after the asphalt playground was removed on the standard topsoiling side of the field. And of course, You know, we're at a university, so we monitor performance. These are some data from 3 years after preparation and construction. From left to right, I show our suburban subsoiling data, the standard topsoiling data, and there was a third field that was left untouched as not exactly a control. It's a little inaccurate to call it a control, but as a reference site. And what we consistently see is dramatic difference in bulk density. Remember, we talked about a 10% increase in bulk density. The standard topsoiling field had a mean bulk density of about 1.76. That's more than a 30% increase in bulk density compared to a healthy soil. But we consistently see lower bulk density, dramatically higher organic matter, a breathtaking difference in infiltration rate. And I have to say, these numbers underestimate the difference in infiltration, because on the topsoiled half of the field, maybe 20% of our infiltration tests showed no measurable water intake after more than 2 hours under a ponded head. So the mean infiltration rate is probably lower on that standard field because we didn't include the zeros. But also equally interesting is much higher plant available water, which is telling us that we've created a soil profile that not only gives us an order of magnitude increase in infiltration, but the rainfall that's infiltrated is being held and retained in the soil, in those macropores, and is available as plant available water to give us a much healthier, vigorous, drought-resistant, deeper-rooted turf grass on the suburban subsoiled half of the field. And again, just to emphasize, we attribute this to the differences in the soil profile. These are cone penetrometer plots for the suburban subsoiled field in green, the topsoiled field in this orange-red color, and these dashed lines at 1.4 and 2.1 megapascal correspond to 200 and 300 psi are sort of rule of thumb thresholds. Below 200 psi at field capacity, most vascular plant roots are not impeded in penetrating a soil. But once the cone index gets above 300 psi at field capacity, most vascular plant roots are not expected to be able to penetrate the soil. So just on this basis, you can see the dramatic difference in the barriers to rooting that the profile, the bulk density or the cone index profile is presenting. So we expect much shallower rooted drought vulnerable turf on the standard field compared to our suburban subsoiling field. In some ways, the proof of the pudding is in the eating, as they say. 4 years after the work was done on these fields, I came out, excuse me, on a spring Sunday afternoon when we were having a typical spring storm here in Maryland, a 24-hour storm that delivered just about 3.2 inches of rainfall, which is the textbook definition of our 2-year storm. On the suburban subsoiling half of the field, you see not really much to see. A very uniform, dense cover of turf, but no puddles or ponding, no rills or sheet flow. The suburban subsoiling half of the field was able, 4 years after being developed, to fully capture and infiltrate the 2-year storm. When we looked at the standard topsoiled half of the field, very different look indeed, right? And we estimate that this half of the field is producing roughly 30 times more runoff on an annual basis than the suburban subsoiled field. But ironically, both half of the fields earn the same credit for MS4 purposes. And the reason for that is the MS4 credit is based on impervious removal. It's based on the absence of impervious area, not the amount of infiltration or runoff reduction that's been restored. So the current regulatory standards don't really provide a direct incentive for either the contractors or the developers to use suburban subsoiling. To us, that suggests an opportunity to change the characteristics, particularly if we can develop a consistent, reliable, reproducible way to quantify the stormwater credit that soil decompaction and amendment should have. So we set out to do that, again, relying on our confidence in our soil physics model. Using a soil physics model makes it much easier to examine different soil profile endpoints, healthy, topsoiled, and suburban subsoiled profiles, and to examine different soil profiles for different soil textures. So we were able to repeat the family of simulations like those I showed you for each of these soil profile types, if you will, for every soil texture. And when we do that from each simulation, we can pull off the individual rainfall runoff events from the simulation. When we look at those individual rainfall runoff events, they're described by the storm event rainfall, P, and the storm event discharge, Q, and we can plot these PQ pairs as storm event rainfall and storm event runoff, which is exactly what curve number hydrology is interested in. And so from this swarm of data points, we were able to fit the curve number equation and find the best fitting curve number to fit these simulated data. And it turns out this example comes from a recreational athletic field on our campus, which is actually quite compacted. It's got a infiltration rate of 7/100ths of an inch an hour. And so it's not surprising that the best fitting curve number to describe our simulated storm events from that field is a curve number of 95. But using that technique, we can develop an effective curve number for both a compacted soil profile and a decompacted soil profile for every soil texture. Here's a result I presented at the Stormwater Conference for the clay loam soil texture. And I showed the clay loam texture because the project we're working on with the Cleveland Metro Parks is a site that happens to have clay loam soils. But repeating those kinds of calculations, we estimate that the effective curve number for a compacted clay loam soil profile would be a curve number of 91. If we were to decompact and amend that clay loam profile and incorporate 2 inches of compost into the top 6 inches of the soil, we would estimate the effective curve number would be 72. And using standard curve number computations, we can then estimate the runoff with and without decompaction for the 1 year or the 2 year storm or any design storm. And so for the 1 year storm, decompacting that compacted clay loam soil profile results in a runoff reduction close to 9/10ths of an inch. Now, my recollection is that 9/10ths of an inch is the precipitation used to calculate your water quality volume in Ohio, and correct me if that's mistaken or no longer the case, but this would suggest in a rough and ready way that just decompacting the soil might be enough to meet your water quality volume requirement. Perhaps more impressive to me is that decompacting a compacted clay loam for the 1 year storm results in the 76% reduction in runoff from the 1 year storm. Now remember, that's a 76% reduction in runoff, not from a impervious surface to a decompacted pervious surface. That's a 76% reduction from a compacted pervious surface to transform it to a decompacted pervious surface. So we can do that for the clay loams, and as I suggested, we've done that for all of the soil textures. Now, don't try to digest these numbers. I know this is a busy table, for which I apologize, but I think an interesting point that we tried to make by color coding these runoff reduction values is, number one, the value of this technique varies with the condition of the soil profile and the texture. Number two, there are soil textures where the runoff reduction you can expect is going to be relatively low. And I've highlighted those in red here. And there are soil textures where the runoff reduction might be high, where high is greater than 3/4 of an inch, low is less than 1/2 an inch, and yellow is a runoff reduction in between. But notice that the low runoff reduction expected from decompaction comes first in the very best infiltrating soils, the sands, the loamy sands, and so on, and in what we expect to be the worst infiltrating soils, your true clay soils. For a sand soil, you know, an uncompacted sand soil might have an infiltration rate of 15 to 20 inches an hour, whereas a compacted sand soil might only be able to infiltrate 5 to 10 inches an hour. But only infiltrating 5 to 10 inches an hour is still quite a bit of infiltration from our perspective. And with respect to the 1-year storm in Northeast Ohio, it's enough to completely prevent any runoff. So the runoff reduction from decompacting soils that are, in a sense, least vulnerable to having infiltration reduced from compaction, decompaction results in the smallest benefit. Conversely, for the clay soils, we expect our clay soils to have low levels of infiltration, even when they're not compacted. We expect a compacted clay soil to have even less infiltration, but decompacting a compacted clay soil is still going to leave us with a clay soil with relatively low infiltration. And for that reason, the expected runoff reduction, again, is going to be relatively small. And the green textures are textures where we might expect the greatest runoff reduction from soil decompaction and amendment. But the key point, I think, is that by characterizing these in a reproducible way, by an effective curve number for compacted and decompacted profiles, we allow designers to do standard design calculations with stormwater, with curve number hydrology, and make value engineering decisions about how this practice as a BMP fits into their overall site plan compared to other BMP practices. And it gives us a consistent reproducible basis to quantify a stormwater runoff reduction credit. I want to wrap up by just addressing a question I often get, and that is, won't these compacted soils heal? Why do we have to worry about compacted soils? After all, vegetation is putting roots into the soil every spring, and in the winter we have frost heaving that's going to break up the soils. Why do we have to worry about compaction? On the right-hand side, I'm showing you some pictures of, this is an access road at the Paint Branch Turfgrass Research Center at the University of Maryland that shows the effect of vehicle compaction. And here are tire trends showing vehicle compaction at a recreational athletic field where people park on the shoulder, rain or shine. On the left, I'm showing you compaction from vehicle traffic on the historical trails of westward expansion that are preserved in our national historical parks. Here's the Oregon Trail and the Santa Fe Trail outside of Fort Dodge and the Kansas Prairie. And the Santa Fe Trail is really interesting because there's extremely careful freight records kept where we know the kind of freight traffic that was being hauled across the prairie on wooden wagon wheels hauled by oxen who are pulling wagon loads that weighed 4,000 kilograms filled with pot-bellied stoves and plow blades, taking them to Santa Fe. And then in about 1865, the first rail spur from St. Louis to Santa Fe was completed, and all the freight traffic on the Santa Fe Trail just dried up. It was all cheaper and faster to ship by rail. So today, more than 150 years after all of that traffic stopped, the Santa Fe Trail in the heart of the Kansas prairie with 90-inch frost depths and prairie vegetation roots that go down 20 feet, that soil is still too compacted for vegetation to grow. And I show these slides particularly to our friends in urban forestry to make the point that, yeah, modest levels of compaction may repair themselves to some extent in the pervious landscape. But we're talking about the kind of compaction that we routinely see in mass grading sites in the urban environment. That's a level of compaction that's not going to repair itself, certainly not on, not on any relevant human timescales, not on the timescale of a political administration or the career of a stormwater engineer or a manager. And I show this picture to make that point again. This was taken on a site of an environmental mitigation project associated with an interstate highway project called the Intercounty Connector, where, long story short, our suburban subsoiling practice was selected by the Army Corps of Engineers as the final preparation to stabilize the site. When they were done with it, the landscape contractor said, sure, no problem, we can do that, but they had never done the work before. They got this lightweight ripping blade from Tractor Supply, because it fit their 3-point hitch, and at its maximum extension, it just barely reached the 20-inch depth of decompaction we had specified. And they started to decompact the soil, and within 30 minutes, the blade was twisted like a pretzel, and this reinforcing plate on the back of the blade that's welded there to keep the blade from bending backwards had caused the weld to fail. So particularly to my good friends who are fans, as I am, of urban forestry and claim to me how tree roots will decompact our compacted urban soils, I like to point out that this 3/4-inch steel shank didn't stand a chance against the kind of compacted soils that we've routinely seen in the built environment, and that if you really want to decompact these soils, proper means and methods and significant intervention is really going to be required. On that note, let me conclude. Hopefully I've helped you warm to the idea that there's this pervasive legacy of disturbed compacted urban soils that affects infiltration, rooting depth, vegetation success, but it's the natural endpoint of our current standards and specifications that has the effect of decoupling the form and function of the landscape. So if we want different outcomes, we need to specify different practices and specify what I call superior sustainable turf that can be established in suburban subsoiling. And we've really been trying to devote a lot of our work towards not just specifying the practice and the depths and the compost criteria, but really trying to advance the institutionalization of this by developing a credit system, by developing a specification. And the key to making this work, I think, is to align the interests of contractors through the specifications that we give them, by aligning the interest of developers by providing reliable credits, and aligning the interests of owners, landowners, to help them understand the superior life cycle costs and reduced irrigation and fertilization required for vigorous landscape, in order to institutionalize the selection of suburban subsoiling as a standard practice and a standard tool in the urban stormwater land development toolbox. But if we do that, we think that we can deliver superior sustainable landscapes of deep-rooted, densely rooted turf grass that will recycle nitrogen and the organic nitrogen and carbon in the soil profile, and also provide a cost-effective BMP from superior sustainable landscapes. So keep this image in mind, and that's really what we're talking about. And on that note, I see I've taken a little longer than I thought, but I'll be happy to take any questions if that'd be helpful.
Thank you, Stu. Can you hear me okay?
Stu, can you hear us now?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. We're going to open it up to the audience here. Kind of project forward. If you got a question, go ahead, back in the back.
The state of Connecticut has a guide development that recommends rating only on the areas you're going to build. In other words, they don't have to start with, and then it improves the site, so you don't have to spend a whole bunch of money smashing it down and then loosening it up. You reduce all the stormwater costs for catchment, and I think that should be taught in college to engineers. It should be part of the guide for development in Ohio.
And I think, just to jump in, we looked at, really preservation as being one of those mechanisms that we can use in the first place, or conservation practices, especially when we're talking agriculture, forestry practices. But Stu, you want to comment on that?
Sure. I had a little trouble understanding the question just because of the echo in the room, but I think I get the gist of it in terms of the preference, as in most pollution control, from avoiding problems rather than correcting them, if that's the gist of it. I'll say two things on that. One, so there's some very interesting research in the literature where folks looked at land development where they did try to stake out and protect areas that they knew were going to be pervious footprints in the final plan to try to protect them from compaction during construction. And what they found was that just the nature of, at least on the projects they looked at, this is by no means inevitable, but they found that inadvertent compaction had actually compacted those areas that had been staked out, just as it had compacted the rights of way for access roads and driveways and foundations. That's not to say it's inevitable, but on a parallel note, one of the things that we have suggested to our DOT is that one way to convey to contractors who are bidding on these jobs the endpoint that you're really looking for would be to add a sheet to a standard set of plans, just as you have a sheet that shows the limits of development and a sheet that shows stormwater details, to add a sheet that shows the site broken out and labeled into 3 different areas. One area where compaction for load-bearing strength is going to be absolutely required. As I say, foundations and underground utilities and road right-of-way. A second area where some degree of compaction for stability, perhaps on graded slopes that are going to be vegetated, but are not going to have any kind of traffic on them. And a third area where the final designated land use is not going to have activities that pose a risk of recompaction. And if you identify those 3 types of areas a priori, the thought is you can leave it to the contractor to decide whether they want to fence off and protect the areas that are being designated for infiltration to avoid compaction, or to do mass grading on the whole site and then come back in afterwards and rip and compost amend the sites. Leave the means and methods to the choice of the contractor, but communicate unambiguously what the acceptance criteria are going to be on those areas. And for those areas that are not going to have activities that pose a compaction risk, the acceptance criteria might be something like, we expect to see cone index values no greater than 200 PSI to a depth of 18 inches post-construction, and an infiltration rate commensurate with an uncompacted soil for the texture and the soil profile at that site. So the thought is, if you communicate what the acceptance criteria are going to be, and the footnote there is, that means the acceptance criteria is going to be more than just establishing permanent vegetative cover, because it's easy to establish permanent vegetative cover in a thin veneer of topsoil over compacted fill. I don't want to drone on about that, but those are some of the thoughts that I think we've had on just that same question of how do we institutionalize this and make it clear and unambiguous for our contractors, and allow them to apply their own ingenuity to deliver this in the most cost-effective and profitable way.
Other questions? You know, we had a few submitted online. Maybe, can you find those?
We did have a couple of people. Oh, yeah, Jay.
Stu, can you show the tool that you use for the incorporation of the organic matter? Do you have this?
Let me see. I'm not sure I have a Spader slide in here. I'm sorry, Jay, I don't have that open readily in the PowerPoint that I put together. What Jay's referring to is a soil tillage implement called a soil spader, which is widely used in the European Union, less so here in the US. In the US, we found it mainly used by nurserymen and organic farmers. But we love the soil spader, in contrast to a rototiller that kind of is like putting your soil through a sifter and grinds it into flour, and doesn't have the ability to penetrate hard compacted soils. The soil spader is really able to do a really superior job of incorporating surface applied amendments uniformly throughout the soil profile. And it does that without pulverizing the soil PEDs, those aggregates in the soil that contain the biological activity. I don't know, Jay, if you want to, add that, having looked into it, I know quite further than we have. But we love soil spaders. We think it's really it's the way to go for incorporation if you possibly have access to it.
I think we've got some questions in the chat. City centers are always contributing heavy stormwater runoff. What techniques do you recommend to local cities to make business comply with desired runoff reduction in runoff contaminants? Particularly interested.
That's the second question.
Oh, is it? Okay.
Yeah.
It's not that clear.
Just help me understand the question. Is it about the contribution from the pervious landscape or just urban runoff in general? I
think we're looking at business comply with reduction runoff contaminants. Yeah, I'm kind of with you on that one. I think the application in city centers might be difficult with the amount of impervious surface there.
Yeah, I mean, there are certainly, practices for those dense ultra urban pervious city centers that you all are familiar with, I'm sure, from the proprietary practices and so on. But I wouldn't comment much beyond that. I think in terms of making recommendations, just because these tend to be so site specific.
The other question, particularly interested in how to best handle storm sewers between homes running from front to rear. It's important to keep stormwater from upstream tributary area, out of footer drains, residential sump pumps. So
okay, I'll interpret that question as a concern about the risks from hitting underground utilities from soil ripping. Is that a reasonable interpretation? And
maybe handling the storm runoff between homes. I kind of think, what you're presenting here is with that better infiltration, we're not going to have the types of runoff that you're generally seeing when those storm pathways are triggered. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, I view this as a way of restoring the infiltration and runoff reduction function of the disturbed urban pervious landscape. But I should add, there are lots of designers, when we first talk about this practice of restoring infiltration in pervious footprints, who think of this the way we think of our traditional BMPs that pond or store runoff, as a way of taking a small green footprint and somehow turning it into a super soil that will be able to completely infiltrate the runoff from a much, much larger contributing drainage area. And I have to really try to gently disabuse folks of that notion. The way I think of this practice is what we're trying to do is restore disturbed compacted soils back to a condition that allows infiltration comparable to the undisturbed soil. But we're not trying to turn compacted clay soils into sandy loams. That requires soil replacement, not soil decompaction. And that's a little hard for folks to wrap their heads around at first, in part because from my perspective at least, the traditional development layout and design with curb and gutter drainage has been to sort of squeeze in as many lots as you can, and on the last least desirable lot, see if you can't somehow engineer all your detention practices onto that footprint. That's a bit of a caricature, but again, I think we're really trying to think of this as trying to get us back to nearly close to an uncompacted natural soil,
not providing super soils that give, miraculous levels of infiltration and make runoff problems disappear. I hope I've addressed the question. Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
I have a question. I'm not a scientist at all. I'm a nurse and a master gardener. From my standpoint, have you thought of you're using turf or sod as your plant of choice? What about using something like adding another field of like meadow plants that have a deeper root system than your typical turf grass? And just
Great.
to see,
Go ahead. Sorry.
just to see if that would make an even bigger difference.
Yeah. Thank you for that question. I'm really glad to get that question, because I sometimes in these audiences, and I do a lot of training. I used to do a lot of training for our master gardeners in the Baywise landscaping program. But I often get that question of, why are you advocating turf grass? And I'll say, I'm not advocating turf grass. I would say plant in your decompacted soil whatever vegetation you prefer, but whatever vegetation you're planting, plant it in a decompacted and amended soil with that porous, pervious, organic rich, biologically active profile that promotes infiltration and water retention. I talk about turf grass often in my talks because it turns out that turf grass is ubiquitous in the urban environment. And I'm sure you've seen some of the numbers that, like the Chesapeake Bay, turf grass, the acreage in turf grass in Chesapeake Bay is greater than the acreage in any agricultural crop. So we talk about turf grass because it's common, if not ubiquitous. It's uniformly found in most what I call commercial development. A builder who puts 75 homes on a 50-acre parcel, but we by no means recommend turf grass as opposed to other grasses or other vegetation. I will say, turf grass to some extent. I'm neither a proponent nor do I oppose the use of turf grass, but I say some of the benefits of turf grass, it does give a very dense cover, and a good stand of turf grass is very protective. You can get 10,000 to even 20,000 blades per square meter of turf grass. So for protecting soil, it has certain beneficial properties. The other thing I would say is I like to show that slide of the slope failure, because many folks will say, well, turf grass is shallow rooted, so we should plant and fill in the blank, prairie vegetation or wildflowers or native plants, because they're all deep rooted. Well, some turf grasses are shallow rooted, but turf type tall fescue, which is our recommended cultivar in Maryland, is deep rooted. Again, I'm not a turf grass advocate. Plant whatever vegetation you prefer. I mean, I love wildflowers and meadow vegetation. We've worked on meadow projects with our state highway administration. The point I would make is, whatever you're going to plant, whether it's turf grass or prairie vegetation or reforestation, I would suggest planting it in a decompacted, amended profile that restores the natural soil processes and the soil ecosystem that maintains a healthy soil, along with the higher expected infiltration rates and water retention that makes for happy, healthy vegetative cover. Sorry for that. I got a little rambly there, but I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, I guess I'm kind of against the status quo is my whole point. And I think, as long as maybe the governments, you mentioned like highways. I know some states are much bigger proponents of adding native plants to their medians and stuff. South Carolina, North Carolina come to mind. And I just wonder why that could be more of a trend.
We encourage a lot of use of natives here for whatever, but the turf aspect is something. We also have a Get Grassy program because we prefer a better turf cover than nothing at all or
Agreed.
bad.
So what Mother Nature is a very bad landscaper.
And this soil idea, you know, that's the base that we have. If you're planting turf on this kind of a base, you're going to have drought-proof sods. You know, you're not going to water as much. The runoff is going to be greater. There's a disconnect between what the developer does, what the homeowner wants, and how we regulate them, what we get done in some of these practices. You know, we look at subdivisions every day here, and it's mass graded. It's just what he was been showing with the clay layers, thin sod laid on top of it. You know, yeah, you can grow your sod there. You're going to be watering like crazy.
Yeah.
You know, that's the problem with that. And the developers aren't getting any credit for that. If they were to deep rip lawns and treat that as that, I really like your curve number analysis there, showing that difference in the curve numbers. And I think that's, you know, a value we can show to developers as they build out on projects, how they can affect their stormwater volumes. They may save a lot or two in a detention basin because they've saved that value on those lots. So I think there's a big tool that we can use if we look at these.
Well, I love the slide with the different soil components.
Yeah.
You know, that's
a big difference.
yeah, because across the country, there's so many different profiles.
Well, if I could just add to that, I didn't talk about it in this talk, but I think one of the things that we've really emphasized in terms of trying to institutionalize this is that part of the reason those standard practices are so deeply entrenched is because of the incentives that we're giving the different participants in the process. So the contractor has the incentive to reach the minimum standard for permanent vegetative cover. And at one time in Ohio, I think that was only 70% cover, and correct me if I'm mistaken about that. But the contractor's incentive is to reach the minimum requirement for permanent vegetative cover as quickly as possible. Once they reach that standard and the inspector signs off on it, the contractors are done. They demobilize, they get their construction bond back, they're off to the next project. Then it's the landowner who's left with the challenge of trying to maintain vigorous vegetation on this disturbed, compacted soil profile with grass growing in a thin veneer of topsoil. It turns out that spreading seed on loosely scarified surface soil with vegetation and mulch will actually germinate and get to 70% or 85% cover, whatever it is, faster than turf establishment on our suburban subsoiled field. And the reason for that, and I have some plots I can show you that make that point, is because when you have that thin root zone, you don't get much infiltration. That means the moisture is being held at the surface. And that higher moisture level at the surface after rain falls leads to faster germination. As soon as the seed germinates, it takes up the water-soluble chemical starter fertilizer that's been left there. It greens up. As soon as it greens up, the inspector is called out to verify that you've achieved 70% or 85%, or on our state highway projects, 95% turf cover, and the contractor's done and gone. So maintaining that becomes someone else's problem. And I've often thought that part of the reason that supplemental irrigation and fertilizer practices are such standard practices, especially on heavily managed urban pervious spaces, is not just the triumph of the fertilizer industry in its propaganda and advertising and marketing, but it's really because those disturbed compacted soil profiles have such low fertility and such a shallow root zone with so little plant available water that supplemental irrigation and fertilization is actually an agronomic necessity on those kinds of soil profiles. So the way to avoid requiring irrigation and fertilizer on the landscape, whether it's turf grass or meadow vegetation or wildflowers, is not to accept those disturbed compacted soil profiles as an acceptable endpoint from land development. I can show you some plots. We did test plots side by side on an old highway right-of-way, very compacted soil, using standard turf establishment methods and suburban subsoiling. And both of them achieved the 95% turf cover that would cause an inspector to sign off on the project. But within a year, the standard turf plots were yellowing. They were showing chlorosis, or essentially nitrogen stress, because once that first spurt of plant available nitrogen from the starter fertilizer gets taken up and essentially washed off in runoff, you're trying to grow vegetation on a very low fertility soil with a very shallow root zone. And within 3 years, that turf had all basically died off and was overtaken by native vegetation. It couldn't survive. Whereas on the suburban subsoil plot, it took longer to get to that high moisture content because so much more of the rain was percolating deeper, wetting up the entire decompacted soil profile. But once it did wet up, you had a much larger reservoir of both plant available nutrients that were being remineralized from the compost and plant available water. So that's a long-winded description of slides I didn't show you, but I think a lot of the answers to those questions really have to do with not just the specifications and requirements that we call for, but who has the incentive to choose a superior sustainable practice. The benefits from doing this that are implemented by a contractor will flow to the landowner in reduced life cycle costs. And so we need to sort of help realign the incentives for each of the communities of professional practice, if you will, that are involved in the process to try and make this to institutionalize this as a sustainable practice. And with that, let me get off my soapbox and forgive me.
We do have a representative from ODOT. John, if you want to respond to that, go ahead and unmute yourself. Talk about the ODOT perspective on natives versus turf.
Yeah, sure. So it's not that big of a deal or anything, but we've tried to plant lots of natives. And we'd all prefer deep rooting grass that's easier to maintain. You have to mow less. That all sounds great. And we all, we have lots of wildflowers patches that we've tried to promote, for monarch butterflies and bees and whatnot, pollinators. The projects that I've been involved on that have tried natives, effectively on a typical construction project, they can throw down their temporary seed and some permanent seeding, and it may not come up very well the first year because they have so little topsoil or such poor growing conditions. But basically, if you mow it 2 or 3 times a year, eventually it'll turn into turf grass. With the native plantings, the prairie plantings, just like if you look at anyone developing, in kind of prairie science or that kind of thing, it takes a few years. You got to get rid of everything else growing there and get the natives growing. So effectively, it's like at the end of a construction project, at least, a contractor can throw some seed down, and eventually just by mowing, it'll turn into turf grass that looks acceptable. If you want natives, it's another 2 years of messing around in there, touching the site again, 3, 4, 5 times a year, at least 2 times a year, to try to use herbicides to kill some plants and get the natives to come up. So, it's not a seed cost thing. It's not even directly a cost thing. It's the ability to, stay at a site 2 years after the construction's finished to try to get natives to grow. So, I completely agree with all the subsoiling and the ripping and the compost. We're doing a lot of that stuff at ODOT, but the natives are, you got to really want it if you're willing to, get in there and get the natives to grow. It's not a plant selection. It's not a cost of seed issue. It's a big extra cost of time and resources to establish that prairie plantings.
Thanks, John. Any other questions? Seeing none, I guess we'll say thank you very much, Stu. We enjoyed your presentation.
Well, thank you. It was really a pleasure, and sorry to be such a blowhard in amplifying the points.
Handled our time nicely, and we appreciate that.
I did get a last minute.
Last minute.
There.
So Or implementing deep ripping suburban subsoiling is described can be a challenge for landowners on heavily developed sites. Underground utilities, mostly space foundations, things like that. And there are recommendations for improving soil permeability in these situations.
Yeah, well, that's a great question too. And some work I didn't talk about, but we were really sensitive to the fact that, you know, having a 75 horsepower tractor and a ripping blade is not something that you're going to bring out to someone's front yard, especially, you know, think about the row houses in Baltimore and so on. So we actually have developed some small footprint practices. We took a practice called complete cultivation that was developed by British Forest Research, which is the equivalent of the research arm of the Forest Service in the United Kingdom. They developed some practices for decompacting soils for reforestation success on open pit mines and abandoned quarries. That's essentially a kind of double digging process. If you have a minute, I think I have those slides I can pull up if that would be useful.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So so this is their diagram, and let me share my screen with the same screen share difficulties, for which I apologize. If you can see this diagram,
Yes,
this is from Forest Research. And again, picture this. This is a mining excavator, right? So the bucket holds 10 yards, and this is a strip mine that's being reclaimed. But the idea is to dig out the top layer, stockpile it next to the excavation, completely decompact and cultivate the lower layer, pull or scrape that top layer back in, because you want to keep the upper soil close to the top, because that's where the biological activity is. And you notice they emphasize that when you do that, the surface is going to be a little bit higher because you've decompacted the soil. Again, this is a practice they've developed, and they've had tremendous success with it on strip mines and abandoned quarries. We tried to adapt it to a 10-foot by 10-foot plot. This was at the Biocycle conference back in 2014 as demonstration plots using a little rubber track mini excavator. But again, going strip by strip, they double dig, decompacted this, and you can see the difference in the cone index profiles for the decompacted plots compared to the standard plots. This is sort of what they looked like when they were done. They were seeded. And one thing I'll point out is the complete cultivation plot with compost developed this lush, verdant turf cover. The standard plot next to it, which just received standard treatment, rototilling, seed, fertilizer, and mulch, not nearly the density or the completeness of cover. And you may notice the difference in the color of the plot. This standard turf plot is showing signs of chlorosis, of nitrogen deficiency that I was talking about a moment ago, because once that little shot of starter fertilizer for the germinated turf gets consumed, it's growing in this relatively infertile fill soil, whereas the suburban subsoiling soil has this deeper, porous, permeable profile that's loaded with organic nitrogen and organic phosphorus that's slowly being remineralized and made plant available and being recycled by the soil ecosystem. But we did it in this spot in particular because there is a storm drain running directly down the middle of this plot. And by marking that, we wanted to show that a skilled equipment operator could do this practice working around the storm drain, and that this would be something that would be practical to do in a residential yard if you were really motivated to decompact your soil. So there are practices, small footprint practices that are available for people who are motivated to do that on something the size, of a residential yard where you can't bring in a tractor. Thanks for the question.
Quite a bit too, so I think you can't do it with a shovel. It takes a lot of work, it takes some time. But
yeah.
even doing something like that improves those soils immensely from what they were previously. I think that's it. This is recorded. We'll be getting out certificates, I guess.
Yeah.
At some point. And I'm going to say thank you for now to our virtual folks. And for the rest of you, you can enjoy a little pizza now. That's what you miss when you come here in person. So, thanks again, Stu.
Thank you, Stu.
We can talk later.
Yeah, thanks very much. Pleasure to join you.
Thank you. So we have pizza in the back room there. Just go back, help yourself. Invite you to stick around and converse and connect, and talk with yourselves. Thank you.